Our wisdom lesson is, I think, the only one I've ever used that actually originated in Springfield, and it comes from my friend, Dr. Todd Scheibel, who's the director and CEO of Borough Mental Health. He said, there are 3 so's that I need answered in any research project. What is so? So what? And so? Tell me what the facts are. Tell me why it matters. And tell me what should be done about it. Now, is religion a matter of beliefs, or is religion a way of living? Is faith a matter of a choice to believe what cannot be known either by scientific evidence or by personal experience? Or is faith a matter of personal courage, of conviction, or better yet, the courage to live by your convictions? If we were to recruit and send out a team of sociology, anthropology, and maybe even theology graduate students, though theology students don't do great research, but if we got genuine graduate school researchers and sent them out to research various flavors of Protestant churches, the Catholic Church, the Greek Orthodox and Pentecostal churches, and then if we sent them to both Shia and Sunni mosques, to conservative and Reform Jewish synagogues, and asked them to find out which religions were interested primarily in beliefs and which were primarily interested in behaviors. If they examined each group's concept of faith as being either belief without evidence or courage to act on principles, I suspect that every single one of those researchers would come back and tell us that all of those groups are a combination of belief and behavior, of faith as courage of convictions, and faith as belief in denial of reason. But Western religions are primarily interested in beliefs. They all imply that it's virtuous to believe what they tell you to believe in spite of the fact that there's no evidence to prove it, that you are a better person if you can make yourself believe sometimes what is clearly not true. Each religion has heroes of their faith who became heroes not because of their faith, but because of their deeds. But if you graph this on a continuum, traditional forms of all 3 of Western religions, major religions, they all tend very strongly towards formalized beliefs. And they use the word faith almost universally to mean a denial of reason. Believing the right things is called orthodoxy. Doing the right things is called orthopraxy. My argument is that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all started out in their first generations as religions of orthopraxy, that they taught leading the good life, how to be a good person. But all 3 of these world religions were co-opted by their governments and by their ruling class, and they were then transformed into religions of belief and of anti-intellectual, may I say, superstition. I contend that the same is true for the parent religion of the 3 great surviving Western religions, that ancient Persian faith of Zoroastrianism. It still exists, very small in numbers, but I think Zoroastrianism also began as a religion of practice, that how do you become a good person in that ancient context was right thoughts, right words, and right actions. That was not about belief or rituals or incantations or creedal confessions, but thinking the right things, saying the right things, doing the right things. And that is at the core of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I would further argue that each of these 4 religions began fundamentally as a revolt, that they were ideologies that were born among the very poor who were revolting against the control and abuse of the ruling class. Inasmuch as you can take the historical narrative of Exodus to be, at least in its outline, culturally true, Judaism began as a slave revolt against the abuses of their masters in Egypt. And that when they escaped, and if you read Exodus and Deuteronomy and Leviticus closely, you see they were very intentional, at least at the literary level, whether they actually did it in real life or not, in creating a non-classed society where there would not be a fabulously wealthy and a very poor. They were very intentional about forgiving debts and not selling yourself into slavery and making sure that everyone had a claim in the economy. But 500 years later, from the Exodus to the coronation of King Saul, Judaism had become the possession of the ruling class, of the elite, who then made the king the center of their religion. Fast forward to Jesus. Jesus was a rebellious religious reformer. Jesus had no concept of starting a new religion. Jesus never was a Christian. Jesus was a Jew who was wanting to reform Judaism and primarily reform it from the perspective of the very poor against the abuses of the rich. Jesus said things like, a rich person has no more chance of getting into heaven than a camel has of being able to walk through the eye of a needle. Jesus reached out to the poor, to the outcast. Jesus eschewed property ownership. He made no claim on money or government or religion. 400 years later, 300 years later, the Roman emperor becomes a Christian. Constantine calls a meeting of all the religious leaders and basically tells them which books are going to comprise their Bible and what they're going to believe and what they're going to teach. Muhammad, in the 5th century, was a reformer who was trying to bring together the disparate warring tribes of his people. And he led a very modest life. He married a woman who had money, but he led a very modest life. His clothing was the clothing of a beggar. He lived in a very small house, and he insisted that the Muslim faith be rooted in a devotion to the rights and circumstances of the poor. As soon as he was dead, the caliphs who took over became fabulously wealthy, terribly violent, and abusive. But that's not how Islam started. A religion that is rooted in orthopraxy is concerned about ethics. It is concerned about life, affirming and valuing a human life. I mean, what we're talking about here, it is the transgendering among us who are the most vulnerable. I think the gay community has made tremendous strides in the last decade, but even still, the transgendered who live among us are in danger constantly, and their value as human beings can be wiped out simply because you're uncomfortable with which restroom they might use or whether they're living in the apartment next to you or not. But a religion of orthopraxy inherently values the value of every human being, especially the ones that stand at the margins. It cherishes, it defends, it sacrifices for the well-being of the poor, the sick, the victims of discrimination and exploitation. Religions that lose that mooring, however, in ethics, religions that become interested in creedal beliefs, in rituals, that focus on what cannot be seen about souls and heaven and hell, the unseen and unknown and unknowable afterlife, those religions immediately begin to diminish the value of a human being. They make suffering and war, slavery and poverty acceptable because this world is less important than the world that is to come, even if the world that is to come is entirely imaginary. Religions of orthodoxy become the tools of governments, of the ruling class. They control the poor and the working class, while religions of orthopraxy become the inspiration of prophets, of reformers, of liberators, and of revolutionaries. Now, there is no religion that is all orthodoxy and no orthopraxy, just as there's no religion that's all orthopraxy and no orthodoxy. They're all a blend. My argument is, though, that the religions of the West have wandered to the far extreme of emphasizing orthodoxy and have forgotten what it means simply to practice your faith in order to become a good person. Progressive religious leaders invite people to lead a good life, not because they fear punishment or they are desiring an afterlife reward, but because there is an inherent value to being a good person. Being a good person is its own inherent reward, which can be kind of vague sounding if you've been brought up from childhood to be afraid of going to hell and desiring to go to heaven and needing to believe that you're going to live forever. I always tell people that my body is made of exactly the same stuff as the ficus tree in my living room, and we're about the same age. And I don't mind telling you, I'm getting kind of tired of the ficus tree. If it's going to live eternally, I've got issues because I'm tired of picking up the leaves. But once that manipulative theological carrot and stick have been taken off the table, we have to do some really serious thinking about what does life mean? Who are we? What do we want to do? What is right and what is wrong? Not because some supernatural theistic God in the clouds told us what is right or told us what is wrong, but rather we are left to figure it out. And one of the really difficult things is that there are things that can be right in one generation that become wrong in another generation. There are things that a culture might do to survive in one context that becomes an absolute abuse in the next generation. We have to be willing to ask hard questions and to deliberate difficult circumstances to decide over and over again, not just what is right and what is wrong, but what is right now, what is wrong now. In the afternoon, in Malvern, I'll be talking about evidence-based faith. I'm advocating an approach to religion that is based on what is known and not on Iron Age myths and superstitions, to depend only on what we can talk about realistically as factual. Physicists have summed up the entire universe as being comprised of 12 different types of subatomic particles that are held together by 4 forces of nature, 2 of which we can see at work, gravity and the magnetic force. The other 2 are visible only at the subatomic level, and they have the very unromantic names of the strong force and the weak force. You never get to see them anyway, so they don't need real poetic names. But basically, these are the forces that hold an atom together that makes it possible for the universe to exist. Accepting this description of reality, 12 particles of matter and 4 forces of nature, we are all made quite literally of stuff that was formed in the center of super hot stars. The 12 particles of matter and 4 forces of nature that give us our bodies are the same 12 particles of matter and 4 forces of nature that comprise the chair that you're sitting on, the bricks of the walls around us, and the trees and the stream down the road, and the stars that are in the heavens above us. As cosmologist Brian Swimme has observed, 4 billion years ago the earth was molten rock. Now it sings opera. It's the same 12 particles of matter and the same 4 forces of nature. We are the product of millions of years of evolution. We are a part of the universe that is now aware of its own existence, that we are able to contemplate the meaning of our existence, and I would even argue that we create the meaning of our existence. So here's the big shift. Here's the thing that makes us dizzy and upsets people and occasionally makes people that you see come to visit us carrying a big Bible under their arms go charging for the doors as soon as they can. You were taught in church not to question. You were taught to accept orthodoxy as a message that was handed to you. This is true, and you are a better person if you just believe it. You were taught to accept that God wrote the Bible. as if the creator of the universe couldn't write a better book than that. I mean, it's just, but we were taught to believe this is God's words. We were led to believe that capitalism was just a part of freedom, democracy, and Christianity, that they were all bound up together, and that we were to defend any one of those with our lives if necessary, if called upon to do so without question. We actually have chaplains in our army, as if you could put Judaism, Christianity, or Islam into a uniform and bless a war. We literally try to combine them. How many churches have you been in that literally had flags in the chancel of the church to say there is no separation between our military and our faith? Is it any wonder that most of the people in developed countries have held on to religion only in the most symbolic ways and for the most nostalgic reasons? The old unquestioning approach to life just doesn't work for thinking people anymore. We've read our way out of that. We cannot force ourselves to pretend. We've thought our way out of it. Some of us were pushed out of it. Some of us were told in the churches we used to go to not to come back. I mean, we have a history with thinking our way out and occasionally getting a boot to the rear that says you are no longer a part of this magical thinking community. Now we understand that to find true meaning to life, that we have to have the courage to question everything. We have not thrown away our sacred scriptures, but we no longer read them as if they were divine legislation. Now we critically examine our faith and our scriptures. Through science, through rational thought and critical thinking, we interrogate the universe to find out what is true. I remember hearing the famous psychiatrist and author M. Scott Peck saying that anything you're not allowed to question is an idol, and all idols are slated for destruction. We have protected our religious idols from scrutiny and preserved them to the threshold of the 21st century, but they really can't go any farther. No longer will we reject our gay and lesbian sons and daughters because some ancient nomadic sheep herder in Palestine condemned homosexuality and wrote it down in a book. I began today with this quote from Dr. Scheibel, the director of Burrell Mental Health. I had applied for a grant from the Burrell Foundation in the year 2000 to do research into methamphetamine addiction. It was a terrible plague here in the Ozarks. Todd called me into the office when he approved the grant for us to do the research project, and he said, these are the 3 things your project has to answer. You have to be able to tell us what is so, and you have to be able to tell us why we should care, and you have to be able to tell us what we can do about it. That is, our research has to discover the facts. It has to be able to communicate to the state government, the county, and the city governments why they should care about what methamphetamine is doing to our population, but we can't stop there. We have to do more than just throw the facts on the table. We have to be able to say what can be done. Otherwise, the research is useless. That conversation has never left me, and I've tried my best to apply it to my life as a pastor, my work in journalism, and my work as a college professor. I don't just gather facts as if it was my job to print a new phone book every year. I need to be able to stand up in front of a congregation or a classroom or write in a book or a newspaper column what is true. But I have to also be able to say why it matters, and I need to be able to say what we should all do about it. If there's a single compelling reason for me to travel to England to talk about progressive faith, it is to answer that 3rd question. What should be done? Many wonderful scholars have written and have described the reasons why we are making this shift from how we read the Bible and how we think about God and how we think about Jesus and other world religions. A lot of people have done great work, and I am completely indebted to the careers of Marcus Borg, John Shelby Spong, John Dominic Crossan, and Karen Armstrong. They have helped us to get a clear vision on how to take an objective approach to what used to be our idols that we could never question. They've done a magnificent job of looking at the Christian religion and helping us to think about it critically, to interrogate it. What they have not done is to tell us what should be done about it. I think they've left that on purpose to practitioners, to pastors, to communities of faith. But none of those leading scholars have tried to talk about what the implication is. More realistically, once we have been disabused of superstitious beliefs in a supernatural theistic being who decided right from wrong, who will send some eternal part of ourselves to either heaven or hell, once we no longer are captured in that intellectual and moral prison, the question becomes, shall we live our lives for personal gratification, or shall we live our lives to try to alleviate suffering, to try to do a greater good beyond the limitations of our own hair and fingernails? If I sit down on a park bench to eat my sandwich and a homeless and hungry stranger sits next to me, I have a decision to make. Do I devour my sandwich as quickly as possible, or do I divide it with the hungry stranger? Nietzsche would tell us that we're weak for even asking ourselves the question. You're weak if you even feel guilt about eating your own doggone sandwich, or at least that's the way Ayn Rand would interpret Nietzsche. My own observation of the way our Western economy has been run, the way our banks, corporations, and sadly enough, our governments basically make decisions, is that they have taken Ayn Rand's objectivism and swallowed it whole. They'll deny it. They'll swear that they don't believe that or they don't follow that. But look at what they do. What they do is as if Machiavelli married Ayn Rand, and that's who's in charge of our banking, our corporate, and our government systems. Scientific thought deals with facts, and facts alone cannot determine ethics. I spent years inviting congregants to reject what cannot be known, what has only been presented to religious people as an assertion of truth. There might be angels and demons, there might be a heaven and hell, there might be souls, ghosts, and spirits, but since we cannot objectively analyze any of these things, I have repeatedly said that it is meaningless to discuss what cannot be known. Still, to be fair, I must acknowledge that there is a truth claim at the foundation of progressive faith. It's just a decision. There is a fundamental moral choice between a life of selfish personal fulfillment and a life lived to deliver the greatest good to the largest number of people. The earth that once was comprised of molten lava that can now rise up and sing opera, through conscious human beings, also experiences a lot of pain, a lot of sorrow, but we have the potential of experiencing a great deal of joy, a great deal of meaning. The choice that I'm making then, the choice that I really hope other people will make with me, is to answer the so question in a way that is not simply self-seeking personal gratification, but is instead a decision to direct your life in a way that gives the greatest good to the largest number of people, and not necessarily the people that are alive today. We can burn coal and have cheaper electricity if we are willing to kill successive generations. But if that matters to you, if your yet unborn grandchildren and great-grandchildren matter to you, then we have to make decisions and sacrifices now. We may have to pay more for an automobile that doesn't pollute as much. We may have to pay more for electricity that doesn't pollute as much in order for the yet unborn to have a future. The popular astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson is fond of saying, and saying it very enthusiastically, that we are all connected. We're connected to each other biologically, we're related to the earth chemically, and we're related to the entire universe atomically. That is a scientific fact. But I'm willing to choose to credit that fact with meaning. I will honor the fact that I'm connected to other human beings, to the earth, to the universe, by trying to reduce suffering, by trying to increase the frequency of joy, to protect the integrity of the lives of even the most marginalized members of our society, and to protect the earth and the universe against being spoiled against future generations. Owning my own connection to the human race and to the earth that we share, I cannot be indifferent about the fact that there are hungry and homeless people in the city where I live, even if I am personally clearly overfed. I cannot be indifferent about the threat of waging war, even if I'm way too old to be drafted by anybody's army. The fact that I have a job does not give me permission to not care about the people who do not. Nor does my access to health care afford me the luxury of being indifferent about people who are sick and don't have access to health care. The fact that my personal neighborhood where I live is free of toxic waste, that I have reliably clean drinking water and fresh air, that cannot make me indifferent about the spoiling of the earth, the air, and the water that impacts mostly the poorest people on earth. Being white, male, and heterosexual and American does not excuse me from the need for liberation from oppression for persons of color, for women, for people of all sexual orientations, races, and all nations of the world. Once Nietzsche was freed from the domination of traditional religion, his choices did not actually make him the Übermensch, the Superman, that he said it did. In fact, if you follow to the logical conclusions of selfishness and self-service, existence itself ceases to have meaning. Nietzsche did not leave the darkness of religious superstition to come into the light of being an evolved superhuman. He left it, I think, to de-evolve into what appears to me to be a kind of existential sadness. The real Übermensch, the real super people of our era, are the people who will sacrifice their own economic stability, their own personal security, in a life of service, of kicking at the darkness until it bleeds daylight. And that, men and women, is a choice, but I'm convinced it's the right choice.
Amen.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Rev. Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.